Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And I'm delighted to have my guest with me today, who is Michele Finey. Welcome, Michele.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So I think most appropriate for this moment when we have Venus and Mars walking hand in hand, we have your book, The Sacred Dance of Venus and Mars. And I remember reading this quite a while back, I think when it first came out, and reading it again, I'm enjoying it all over again. And I think a good place to start would be for you to describe the dance.
Well, look, it's a little bit technical, and it was back in, I think, 2008. I asked myself a question, which was how often do those conjunctions of Venus and Mars happen? And I ended up plotting, I don't know, thousands of years of conjunctions onto this big spreadsheet. And every 32 years, the conjunction point moves along the zodiac a little bit, sometimes retrograde and sometimes direct. But each and every Venus-Mars conjunction steps along that way in 32-year cycle. So, but it wasn't until I plotted them all down that I sort of saw the scope of it and how amazing it is. And it sort of led down other pathways as well of interest and research, which I really had no comprehension of prior to that. So it's been a really fascinating, I guess research always turns up things that you don't expect, and that's why I enjoy research. I think you always find something, and it just illuminates the cycle, particularly planetary cycles, which is something I've always been interested in. One of the things that I think blew my mind really was to discover the relationship between copper and iron, which mirrors exactly what's happening with Venus and Mars, both of archetypes and also as what they're doing in the sky. It's just astounding, in fact. And my partner, who's an electrical engineer, and I did a joint presentation in Florida at the Kepler conference back in 2017, which we had a lot of fun with. But it was great because just the scope of the Venus, Mars and copper iron relationship is just phenomenal. You know, copper and iron are used to drive our motors and machines, and they generate magnetism and electricity, just the same way that that Venus and Mars have this amazing magnetic energy. A lot of power and energy is created.
So, okay, you've said quite a few things there already, which are like little teasers. I think you're going to have to flush them out a bit. So, firstly, you've kind of been talking about the cycle, but I think I'd like you to do that in a bit more detail so that we understand more what you're talking about.
Yeah, look, each Venus-Mars conjunction is part of a 32-year cycle, and they stretch through time. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's very similar in a way to the Saturn cycle. And every so often you have a new cycle that begins. And in fact, these cycles commence in pairs. So you have these two conjunctions we're currently experiencing in February and March are in fact new cycles. So if you were to look 32 years back in your ephemeris, you wouldn't see a Venus-Mars conjunction at the same, roughly around the same degree area. But if you look forward, you will see every 32 years that they carry on. So we know for that reason that these are the beginning of a new cycle, and these don't happen very often. The last time was 1983, and prior to that, 64 and 77. But then there's a way back, you know, a couple of hundred years before there was a previous new cycle. So they're grouped also in periods of time of around 70 years. At the same time, you also have cycles ending in groups of 5 in pairs. So actually 10 conjunctions. They're grouped in that way. And so the number 5, of course, is very synonymous with Venus. And in fact, it is Venus that drives the whole Venus-Mars relationship, because when she stations direct in the morning sky, that's really, as soon as she's done that, it's her signal in a way to commence a new relationship with Mars. So currently, we've just recently had Venus going direct, and yes, then the conjunction with Mars, again, that's how we know it's a new beginning of a new cycle. They contain a lot of energy, and it sort of makes for an energy shift, quite a dramatic energy shift when these new cycles commence.
Would the reason why Venus is the driver be because she's the faster moving of the two?
I'm not entirely sure why, but that would make sense. Yes, all the way through, it's her station direct that kicks off a new cycle, and her station retrograde that concludes the cycle over, periods of a long period of time. And in the middle of each of these series of conjunctions, there is a Venus-Mars-Sun conjunction. So it kind of confirms, in a way, this research that I did back then, it kind of confirms the fact that the Venus solar cycle starts with the inferior conjunction, because the station direct happens just after inferior conjunction. And always you have the Sun, Venus, Mars conjunction in the middle of these cycles, never at the start or the end. So, yeah. Does that make sense, I hope? Not too confusing. It is quite complex. It's a complex system. Yeah.
It is a complex system. And I'm just thinking of viewers who are a bit newer to astrology. And you mentioned the Saros cycle. So I think perhaps a little explanation of that would be helpful.
Well, it's like an eclipse cycle. So every 18 years you have another eclipse happening in that pattern. The eclipse points commence at the poles and sort of curl around the planet. And yes, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end that covers several thousand, couple of thousand years in a similar way. So it's the universe is quite amazing. And how things play out. I've just found that this Venus-Mars material, I think, it's just, you can see it operating on a personal level with individuals, but you can also see it happening in a social and cultural way. So the big shifts will happen in terms of society. For example, 1964 was the first new series we've had for several hundred years. That was the very first one in the current group of 5 or 10 conjunctions, pairs of 5. And of course, 1964, we know, there was, of course, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction happening in 66. But of course, this was also going on. So you saw, major change in terms of music, in terms of the relationship between men and women, in relationships generally. People were openly talking about matters that they previously didn't discuss, sexuality. The role of women changed dramatically because of the pill and other, social and cultural change. So there was a groundswell of change that happened across society at that time, which was to do with relationships as well as, the broader political changes that were going on as well. Yeah.
You talked about conjunctions happening in groups. So again,
Yes.
could you clarify whether that group of conjunctions is happening in the same sign? Because you were talking about the degree. So could you just clarify for people
Mm,
whether conjunctions are moving sequentially through the zodiac, or whether there's a
yes.
that they work through a particular sign?
No, they step along the zodiac in degrees. At the beginning and the end of each cycle, the gaps between the degrees are wider. So, for example, we had 16 degrees of Capricorn was the conjunction we had a few weeks ago, and we've got another one happening in a few days on the 6th of March, right at the beginning of Aquarius. In fact, it's at 00 Aquarius 01, the first minute of arc of Aquarius, which is kind of in itself quite significant, I think. So there was, about a bigger gap at the beginning. And as those 32-year conjunctions move on and they get closer to the middle of the cycle, the increments between the degrees is about 1 or 2 degrees. It gets smaller and then it gets wider. The orbs get wider towards the end. But it's still, you can see that pattern. Yep. It's moving through the zodiac. Yep.
So you've talked about it, what it means in terms of society, there being, big social changes. And of course, going from Capricorn to Aquarius is a huge difference as well, that we can possibly expect. Now, what does it mean in terms of an individual?
Well, that's a good question. I know, for example, you see a lot of people those that are born with a Venus-Mars conjunction, generally tend to be very passionate people on one level or another. People like Tom Jones, very, very close conjunction. We've got a well-known footballer here in Australia called Dusty Martin, who is just an incredible footballer. He's got a very close conjunction in his chart and very passionate about his sport and very disciplined. Then you have people like Prince Andrew, who's currently had Pluto pummeling his Venus-Mars conjunction. So that's going to be a complete transformation for him and his lifestyle. So, for an individual with Venus-Mars conjunction, and in fact, some of the further research I've done on some of the other aspects of Venus and Mars is also quite interesting. It seems a lot of comedians have a Venus-Mars square in their charts. I'm not quite sure how many, but there's a lot. A lot of the Monty Python crew, I think 4 of the 6 of them have Venus-Mars squares in their charts. Lenny Henry, Oliver Hardy, Peter Cook, Benny Hill, Magda Szubanski, they all have Venus-Mars squares. I think Ronnie Corbett, there's a huge number of them have Venus-Mars squares, which I find fascinating and a very quirky aspect. Sean McAuliffe, who's an Australian comedian, is a brilliant writer, lives not far from me actually, and has a regular program on TV here in Australia. He's got a very tight Venus-Mars square. So, these little gems pop up from time to time. It's there's a lot of intensity, a lot of passion and creativity in the aspect, not just conjunctions. So, yeah.
I was just thinking about that. And I was thinking, in terms of, comedy, a lot of comedy is like a safety valve for anger. It's
That's
a release
true.
of anger. And I'm just thinking about, Venus using her good humor to pacify Mars.
Yes. I never thought of it that way. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's comedy is very, very important because it does play this this part. It's almost like a cathartic release of
that's true.
frustration and anger. It's very,
Yeah.
very important. And I wow, it's that tension, isn't there? You know, it's, you could see Mars getting more and more and more worked up, and then Venus says something that,
That's right. Yeah.
that makes him laugh, and it's like poof, you know, all gone. So I think that's very interesting, and
Yeah.
it's very sacred, a sacred history to comedy, you know, in terms of ancient theater, etc. Because it's,
Yes.
you know, as we know, theater was a conduit, you know, for communication with the gods, and comedy, I think, was part of that. So
Yes.
I find that very interesting that there should be
Yeah.
strength.
Just by the by, as you mentioned that point, I was realised that Sean McAuliffe's program that he has on here every Wednesday night, it's called Mad as Hell. It's classic.
We've never heard of angry comedians before, have we?
Yeah.
And we always say, you know, that humor is what's needed to get us through
Yes.
tension and really dark periods in life. So wow, okay, that's very interesting, to
Yeah.
my mind, to find that. So what other great gems have you discovered?
Oh, gee, now you've put me on the spot. Well, the copper iron stuff I find fascinating because it just came to light quite by chance. Was when I was doing the initial research for my and writing my book, that Neil, my partner, and I just happened to sit down and watch a documentary on electricity one time, and they started talking about copper and iron. Of course, I immediately thought Venus, Mars, what's going on? You know, described the whole relationship between copper and iron, and he then elaborated. And well, where do I start? In the copper iron relationship in a machine, it generates, you know, power and all the turbines and everything, all motors, electrical motors use copper and iron, and they have to work as a partnership, an interaction. The electricity is used by Venus, and the iron is Mars, is the magnetism, and they work in a partnership. If, for example, a machine breaks down, there's usually a couple of reasons for that. One is either the copper or the iron is of poor quality, or one is trying to dominate the other.
That's
Now,
relationships in a nutshell.
if the machine breaks down, usually it has to be replaced with new copper. It might be able to be salvaged and repaired with new copper. But if the iron is broken, it's irreparable often. So, you know, there's all these analogies. The more you get into it, it's extraordinary. And I'm not an electrical engineer, but my partner is. Actually interesting because we have some very interesting Venus-Mars synastry, as you can probably imagine. So this all just came to light as well, which, you know, the more I got into it, when copper and iron initially interact in a machine or in a motor, it's Venus that turns on the Mars. In Venus, copper turns on the iron, and it's an initial inrush of energy that creates that, and it's very excitable and very intense initially, but then it calms down into a sort of relationship where they sort of exchange energy in a more measured way. So it's all these, you know, it's just the same as in relationships. It's just extraordinary.
You know, sometimes I just think, My goodness, our ancestors really knew what they were doing when they
I
started to
don't know how the alchemists knew this. I have no idea. But
well, they must have been playing around with stuff and seen
mm,
it. It's just astounding. What
yes,
it sums up relationships in a nutshell beautifully,
that's
this.
right.
So
Yes.
I'm just thinking then, because we're talking about alchemy,
Mm,
and the alchemist idea of the integration of masculine female energy.
mm,
And here we have it. We need iron and copper to make it work. We need that integration of the two, call it
yes,
yin, whatever way you want to put it. We need those two energies. They need to be valued. They need to be
yes.
valued. And one not above the other. They need to be
Correct.
both.
That's when relationships break down. That's when machines break down. That's when one tries to dominate the other. That's right. They have to work as a partnership. Yeah. It's interesting also too, I believe in biology, because of course we have copper and iron in our bodies, and iron is quite difficult to assimilate apparently in the body, but it works better if you've got enough copper in your system.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
there's little gems like that pop up from time to time. It just never ceases to amaze me.
I've never lost this image from way back when I first started reading about astrology, and somebody was talking about, the fact that Mars's anger was really only ever pacified by Venus, that it was when he was in the throes of amorous ardor that, his lust for destruction and war was quenched. And I think that there's something very powerful in that thought here. Venus could be too passive without Mars. She was a good time girl, wasn't she, after all? And
Yes.
to have that, just ignite her, Mars igniting her, but equally he needed something to cool him down.
Yeah.
And I think that that's Venus's function. So again, we're talking about the need for the two energies.
Yes.
So it's
yeah. It is interesting, and what they do in the sky is equally interesting too, because Venus will reach her sort of greatest elongation from the sun when she's around 45 degrees from the sun, give or take. And Mars stationary points will vary a little bit to where the sun is, but on average, they're 135 degrees from the sun, which means that Mars stationary points and Venus greatest elongation points are actually 90 degrees from each other relative to the sun. So it's, again, that 90 degrees sort of comes into play. So, because whenever there's a Venus-Mars opposition in the sky, Mars is always going to be either retrograde or stationary. Venus can be anything. She can be direct, stationary, or retrograde. Very, very often, though, very seldom rather, do you ever have Mars and Venus both retrograde and in opposition. Doesn't happen very often. Usually she's direct. Yeah.
I love the way that there's patterns, that if you could actually trace their route around the sun, you would see beautiful patterns. Tell us about those.
Oh, there's some extraordinary patterns that I've illustrated a couple of them in the book. Actually, I think I've got it here, which I actually originally got from John Martineau's book by permission to use them. You will have seen the Venus flower pattern in the Venus Sun Earth relationship. But interestingly, the Venus-Mars pattern is very similar to the Uranus-Pluto pattern. I don't know if you can see that there.
Yes.
Yeah, quite similar. So again, that I think illustrates that oppositeness that that create. It is endlessly fascinating topic. I think it's significant though, the what's going on in the world at the moment. We have a lot of change happening, you know, all of a sudden. I'm still hopeful, I think, that this new conjunction that's going to happen on the 6th of March at the gateway of Aquarius, I mean, literally 1 minute of arc into Aquarius, will, you know, propel us into, and you can see the community spirit coming together a lot as a result of recent events in Europe. I'm hopeful that this will, you know, be the beginning of a positive shift. I hope. Yeah.
I am hopeful too, because there's so much, because there's the Jupiter Neptune conjunction that we can also enjoy.
Yeah.
And there's the Aquarius, and I can feel, regardless of what's happening in the Ukraine, before that, I could already feel the desire for unity, because there's so much driving division, and what's happening is that the drivers of division are actually creating unity.
Yes, that is correct.
And that's because,
feeling that too.
That's because that's what we want, what we crave, what we want. We don't want separation, we want union. And the more extreme the dividers become, the more we crave the union. So I'm looking at this union of Venus and Mars in Aquarius as indicative of that desire becoming manifested.
Yes, yes.
And I think that's something I've not seen in my lifetime. The hunger for unity that I'm seeing at the moment, I've not seen in my lifetime. So it's I know that a lifetime is nothing in, you know, in terms of history, but I can't recall periods in history where there's been such an outcry for unity from the heart of ordinary people.
Yes.
So I'm hopeful.
Yes, I'm hopeful. Interestingly, it'll be roughly 2 years before we get another Venus-Mars conjunction. That too will happen in Aquarius in 2024. And of course, we've got Pluto about to transition there as well around that time next year for a brief period before it fully engages there. And we've had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 Aquarius as well not long ago. The end of 2020, was that when it was? Yeah. God, time moves along. So yes, that progressive, I think, community response to things. And of course, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the world. I mean, we've just got major floods here happening in New South Wales and Queensland at the moment. I mean, it's unprecedented. They've just had massive flood emergencies all along the east coast of Australia currently unfolding. And people have been out, you know, rescuing people off roofs in kayaks, you know, just out there, you know, they're picking up their pets, and, you know, people donating everything to help, and seeing the same sort of response, I think, in Europe to events there. So, I think you're right. That community response and cohesion is, is wonderful.
This is a good point at which to end, in hope.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Michele, so much for your time today. And
thank you. Been a pleasure.
the book that we have been enthusiastically discussing is called The Sacred Dance of Venus and Mars, and I will put a link to that on the description box. And Michelle, if people wanted to learn more about you, contact you, how could they do that?
My website is celestialinsight.com.au. Yeah, so I've perhaps could just do a quick plug for my new book, which has just come out, all about stationary planets. So you'll find that there too.
Well, I thank you again, and thank you all for watching. And do remember, if you haven't already, subscribe. If you've got questions, feel free to ask them. I always reply. And we can look forward to talking about the centaurs next time, and with no other than Melanie Reinhardt. So until then, goodbye.